Hello, my name is Adrian Goldberg, and welcome to the Byline podcast from the Byline Times. It's what the papers don't say, what radio doesn't report, and what telly doesn't tell you. This time, Kier Starmer's landslide dilemma, or how to make every vote count. If Labour wins an outright majority in the 2024 election, as the polls suggest, does their leader accept this as a gift from the gods and take advantage of our first-past-the-post system? Or does he take the opportunity to reshape politics once and for all by introducing proportional representation, which would ensure that there were no wasted votes? It's one of the quirks of our current arrangement that Starmer's Labour could win 450 seats with a lower share of the vote than Jeremy Corbyn in 2019, because right-wing voters are split between the Conservatives and Reform. Reform might only get a handful of seats, while the Lib Dems could secure 50 with fewer votes. This is all according to analysis by the pressure group Make Votes Matter, who reckon that if the polling trends are accurate, we could have the most skewed election result ever. For Starmer, this might seem like a happy accident, but of course, the system also means that at other times, the Conservatives are dominant despite not having the backing of the majority of the country. They won 45% of the vote in the 2019 election, but were able to govern as if votes for Labour, the Lib Dems, the SNP, Greens, Plaid Cymru and other smaller parties simply didn't matter. Let's talk now to Sean Roberts from Unlock Democracy, which campaigns for political reform in the UK. And when you look at those figures, Sean, that have been put together by Make Votes Matter, they do make out a pretty persuasive case for proportional representation, I'd suggest.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. And I mean, it is an excellent piece of research that Make Votes Matter have done. We start from the view that the number of seats you win should be related to the number of votes you get. So if you get half the votes, you should get half the seats. But that just doesn't happen with our electoral system. We get distorted results. And this one, as has been said, could be the most distorted one we've ever seen. And what that really means is people aren't getting what they vote for. And that has a corrosive effect, I think, on our politics and trust in our politics. It's really hard when you sort of meet a young person who has actually gone out and used their vote, and yet they just feel like if they live in the wrong part of the country, they might just end up with like no representation. And they can just say, well, what's the point? I could keep voting from now until I'm old and I might never get any representation. And I think that it's that kind of thing that is really damaging in our politics. And let's just say, if the current polls are correct, the third, fourth, fifth parties, the smaller parties, could get as many votes as the Labour Party. And the Labour Party are probably going to get, well, on some of these polls, 450 seats, as you said. And those other parties might get as low as 50 or 60. Same number of votes, dramatically different outcome. And I think that could have a really damaging effect, again, on people that have done the right thing. They've gone out to vote and they've just not got what they voted for.
I guess the argument in favour of first past the post, certainly the one that I hear most often, is that you get generally a clear-cut result. At the end of most first past the post elections, we know who the largest party is by seats. That party then gets to choose its leader as prime minister, and everybody knows where they stand. And the rules aren't the same for everybody.
Yeah, but when you look at this and say, you can look at, there's been 2 elections in the last 20 years where we've had governments in this country elected with majorities on around about 35% of the vote, or 37% of the vote in David Cameron's case in 2015. So nearly 2/3 of the country did not vote for those governments. So yes, it's clear one party has won, but for 2/3 of the country, that is not what they voted for. And maybe if then, perhaps governed in a way that's sort of acknowledged the fact that they only got just over 1/3 of the votes and came along and said, well, I must govern for everybody, not just the people that voted for me, maybe the strength of feeling against this system would not be as strong as it is today. But really, that's what it's given us in this country. And I think when you sort of say we've had strong governments, I mean, the last 9 years, we've had 5 prime ministers, 4 general elections, and probably one of the most chaotic periods in our country's history, really. And could anyone say this is strong government through this period? So I think a lot has changed, but our system has not. And it is really at the root of a lot of the problems of our politics in this country.
Yeah, certainly the argument that it leads to stable government, you would find hard to justify based on the years since Brexit. Boris Johnson winning a landslide majority, then being replaced by Liz Truss after her chaotic period in charge. You then get Rishi Sunak. So, two of the last three prime ministers elected not by the country at large, but elected by the Conservative Party membership, certainly in Liz Truss's case, with pretty horrific results economically for the country. The argument against PR, though, is that you get instability built in right from the start, that you have coalitions, that you have compromises. Of course, in some people's eyes, that might be a very good thing, but it does mean that if you vote for Party A, in all probability, they might have to do a deal with Party B or Party C, which means that the things that you thought you were voting for actually won't be enacted in Parliament.
I see that. And I think what I would say is that, I mean, I think the concept of a two-party system in this modern day and age, in a country like the United Kingdom, for us to sort of have to sit there and say, there can only be two choices, there can only be two ways for a government. I think people want more choice than that. And we have a system that basically does not allow that and tries to force people into, two opposing camps in an election after election. And the people just aren't there anymore. So I think that in itself is a problem. And well, what I would expect to see in a proportional representation type future, you would see parties working together. And where there's common ground, I think that's a really, really healthy thing. At the moment, I mean, when was the last time we saw legislation in this country go through with perhaps bipartisan support? It is so rare. And yet on so many issues, I think you probably could find common ground between different parties on areas. I think people would love to see a bit less conflicts in our politics and to different parties trying to find a way of saying, you know what, the care crisis, how do we tackle this? We've ignored it for decades. How are we going to tackle it? Let's come together and find a solution that we can all get behind. That's the kind of politics that I think would be better for this country. And the evidence from countries abroad is that actually it does lead to more stable governments. Yes, there's always, a few headline cases of things not being good, but that's probably more related to that country itself and where the people are in that country. But, you can look at Germany, for example, with very, very stable politics, and lots of other countries in that sort of area as well. And in fact, we've had PR in Scotland and Wales for the last 20 plus years. And I think both Scotland and Wales have had pretty stable governments throughout that period. So I think it is a myth perpetuated by supporters of the current system that you're going to end up with any kind of chaos under a PR system. It's just not backed up by the evidence.
I find it intriguing that it has slipped off the radar in terms of the 2024 election. So that, for example, votes for 16-year-olds has been raised. This is a proposal supported by the Labour Party, amongst others, and opposed by the Conservatives, but it has been mentioned in the discussion around the election, but PR hasn't. And the reason I find that interesting is that if you look back at Labour Party conferences in 2021, in 2022, motions from members of the Labour Party suggested this was the most popular issue that they wanted to debate. And there's been a recent survey just come out in the last few days by the polling organisation Savanta, which shows that 47% of Labour voters back PR, 37% are in favour of keeping first past the post. So Labour supporters, seeing the polls, which suggest that the party that they support is likely to be a clear winner under first past the post, nevertheless seem to be calling for proportional representation. They don't want the clear-cut winner to be Labour one election, the Conservatives the other, and this pendulum seemingly swinging from one pole to another.
I mean, I think it's a great shame. I think a lot of people are looking at this election and you could list out many, many important issues that aren't being discussed. And to a large degree, that comes back to our voting system. That general elections are decided by, a small number of marginal seats and usually a small number of voters that are swing voters in those marginal seats. And the entire election campaign for both major parties ends up being geared around the issues that those very specific voters care about, rather than the majority of the country. And I think that is really problematic, and again contributes to people thinking, why don't politicians talk about the issues that matter to me? Now, specifically with PR is one of the solutions to restoring trust in politics. It's not the only thing, but it's definitely one of the things that can actually contribute to doing that, where people actually start to get what they vote for. And I think that's an entirely positive thing. The Labour Party has come a long way on PR. The majority of the members in the Labour Party support PR, the majority of the trade unions, and a large number of the likely incoming new MPs will be supporters of PR. But it is not a one-party issue. Reform back PR. There are Conservatives that back PR. If you want to have a modern democracy where there are more than two choices, PR is the necessity to actually make it work. Scotland is a really interesting case because you can sit there and compare PR elections to non-PR elections. And in 2015, the SNP won 57 of the 59 MPs under first past the post in Scotland. There were no Conservative MPs, there was one Liberal Democrat, there was one Labour. At the same time, they only have half the MSPs in the Scottish Parliament, and there is representation for the Conservatives, Labour, Liberal Democrats, Scottish Greens. And that is the difference between two systems. The votes cast in the two different elections, Scottish Parliament and Westminster elections, broadly are roughly the same sort of share of the vote, but the outcome could not be more different. And I think even Conservatives in Scotland would probably say, actually, we quite like the PR system in Scotland, and it certainly works better than first past the post. So I think that's a really important consideration. And I hope that after the election, after people look at what's likely to be a very disproportionate result, there's an actual proper honest conversation about, does the current system work? And I think it doesn't.
Only 20% of Conservative voters, according to this Savanta poll, support PR. But if you look at other parties, then support seems much greater. You've got 64% of Greens backing it, 53% of Reform voters, 54% of Liberal Democrat voters. Now, you might argue that all of those parties have a vested interest in supporting PR. All three of those, the Greens, Reform, and the Liberal Democrats, would get more seats under PR. The Conservatives, you can argue, have been the greatest beneficiaries of first past the post, but Labour have been also when they have been in power. But I do find this intriguing, this very strong thread of Labour supporters now over time who would even see that even though their party might get this clear-cut election victory, nevertheless, they want first past the post. So taking a strategic view, if you're a Labour supporter, yes, Kier Starmer might get a landslide majority this time, but over time, first past the post arguably disadvantages Labour quite significantly as well.
Yeah, I mean, it does and it doesn't. I mean, it favours big parties. That's what it does. And it favours parties with very concentrated levels of support. The SNP win 57 of 59 MPs on about half the vote in Scotland. But in terms of UK vote, it was about 4% of the UK population that suddenly had 57 MPs. Yes, support historically has been lower in the Conservatives, but if there is a very disproportionate outcome to this election, you might see some change in that amongst Conservative supporters. And I think the key thing with an electoral system, it shouldn't be something that favours any one party. It should be a system that accurately represents the way people vote. And I think that's what we need to get to. And I think certainly amongst some of the Labour supporters you're talking about there, I think there is an awareness now of just how broken the political system appears to so many people. I suspect we're going to see a low turnout in this election, which is really worrying. That's not good for democracy. And that low turnout won't even include the millions of voters that aren't even registered. And that is not a good thing for our democracy. And if you really want to get trust back into politics, or, obviously it's never going to be perfect because, politics is politics, but we need to sort of get some confidence from the people back in the political system that those that they elect are going to help them and are going to address the problems that they have. And that's not what they feel right now.
No, just worth pointing out that in 2020, Kier Starmer was speaking at an open Labour and Electoral Reform Society hustings. He said then that millions of people vote in safe seats and feel their vote doesn't count because they vote for the opposition party in those safe seats. And he said that's got to be addressed. But he's told ITV News recently that he thinks that first past the post is the right system. And he says it has given a strong government in this country and we are not making any changes to it. So Keir Starmer himself could not be more categorical, regardless of what many Labour members and indeed Labour voters think. One of the criticisms of proportional representation that I hear, particularly from people on the left, Sean, is that it would allow the right, the far right, into government. That we've seen this with the growth of Geert Wilders in Holland, with the Rassemblement National in France, with AfD in Germany, and they fear that proportional representation would allow groups like Reform. It would encourage them. It would encourage their voters to think that they would have a greater say and therefore might drive support for those parties that those on the left don't like.
That's an argument we hear. But when you actually look at the facts, is it actually backed up? The United States of America has first past the post voting. Donald Trump has taken over the right-wing party in the United States and moved politics further to the right in the United States than I think anyone ever dreamed imaginable. It's not about the electoral systems at that stage. And if you actually look at what's been going on in Europe, well, okay, yes, the far right got more votes at the European election. But when you look at the seats won, because the European elections being fought under proportional representation, even in France, where they got around 33% of the vote, they only get a third of the seats and they don't get 2/3 of the seats. And yes, with proportional representation, smaller parties can get a small number of MPs on small votes. I think the poll that's given Reform the most seats in Parliament at the moment is about 18 seats out of 650. You know, I think that is not likely to really change everything. And I think you have to say, if over 10% of people vote for a party, then that party does deserve representation in the House of Commons. Not being in the House of Commons hasn't stopped Nigel Farage having a very large impact on our politics in the last few years. So I don't hold that as a thing. And just to say as well, you might say that under PR, far-right parties could get into Parliament easier because they could get in on say, 5% of the vote potentially. But if you actually talk about how many votes would they need to do to take charge and be in real power, well, under proportional representation, if you don't get 50% of the votes, you don't have all the power. But under our system, we've seen you can win general elections on around a third of the vote. And that is a very low bar for a party to have all the power. I don't think.
I suppose the argument is that if you are a party with, let's say, 7 or 8% of the vote, and this may apply equally to the Greens on the left, Reform on the right, and another party has 45% of the vote, you can hold the balance of power and have a disproportionate effect on that basis.
That is possible, but that's always then a result of negotiation. And I think one of the things you would see, and I think we've seen this in countries that do have proportional representation, what you end up with is much more talking between the parties. And so, yeah, you could say, I've got 45% of the seats, I need to get 7% more. I could talk to that extreme party, whether that's on the left or on the right. Or you could actually talk to one of the more mainstream parties and say, okay, let's work something out. And obviously, like in Ireland right now, we've got, I'm not quite sure how to describe Sinn Féin's politics, but nationalist politics. And the two mainstream parties have worked together to keep them out of power. And they have the majority of the vote behind it. So I don't hold it to be effectively the tail wagging the dog. That's a choice for political parties. But what there'll be is far more transparency and far more discussion, open discussion, I think, about how our politics should be. And I think one of the things that's been really problematic is parties promising they can deliver all these things in direct contrast to another party and then really struggling to deliver. And I think we'll have much better politics again if we'll have more common ground where there's actually agreement, parties working together. And that will be strongly encouraged by proportional representation. Wouldn't it be great if the opposition party actually agreed with what the government are doing, that it didn't just oppose for the sake of it? And they actually said, oh, no, we can actually support that. Wouldn't that be a better kind of politics?
Yeah, so that we have a less polarized politics and a less
Yeah.
polarized society, perhaps. Of course, we did have a referendum in the days when referendums were all the rage on proportional representation. That was the price that the Liberal Democrats under Nick Clegg extracted from David Cameron for being coalition partners in 2010. But I have to say, and I don't know if this was deliberate, though I suspect it may have been, the method of proportional representation that was being voted on seemed to me to be extremely complicated. I've
Yes.
seen proportional representation at first hand in the mayoral elections. I vote in the West Midlands, where you could vote for one, two, three candidates, I think. But certainly, if the first candidate that you voted for didn't get elected, then your vote would transfer onto your number two candidate. And if that person didn't get elected, onto your number three candidate until they built up to 51%. Now, I understood that. I really welcomed that where I lived in the West Midlands because it allowed me to vote for a non-mainstream party in the first instance, suspecting they probably wouldn't get elected, and then for a more mainstream candidate. But at least my vote in some way registered. That was scrapped for the mayoral elections recently. We had first past the post for the English mayoral elections. So can we devise a form of PR that is simple to understand and that you think could get buy-in from the British public? Because that has been an issue in the past.
Yes. I mean, the answer is yes. And I think what we would like to see the next government do, whoever it may be, is actually set up a royal commission or something similar that actually goes and looks at the issue of restoring trust in politics. And one of the issues it looks very closely at is changing the electoral system and introducing a form of PR. And I think allowing the experts, perhaps with even a citizens' assembly or actually getting involvement from real people to try and look at the different systems, the different options that are there, because there are multiple PR systems that would produce a much, much better outcome than our current first past the post system. The referendum that took place over 10 years ago, it wasn't even a system of PR that was being put forward. But what I would say about it is that if you look at everything that's happened in our politics since then, people have a very different view of how well our politics is working today than they did it back in 2011. And I don't think a decision taken then has any impact on how people feel now. And I don't think people should feel bound by something that just feels like is from a different era almost.
No, well, it almost seemed as though Nick Clegg, on that, as in other issues, had been utterly bamboozled or dazzled by the prospect of nearly being in power alongside David Cameron. It's just kind of weird when you look back at it. But I suppose the biggest issue that reformers have is that if you have a situation, the one that we expect in the forthcoming election, where one party is a clear winner, they are going to have to be the turkeys voting for Christmas.
Yes, it's a bold thing. And have you ever met a politician that almost doesn't have a sort of thing where he says, if I didn't have, or he or she says, if I didn't have a bit more power, I might be able to do a bit more good. So it's kind of like a thing that's kind of built into everyone of like, if I had a bit more control, I could do even better. But you actually have to look at the results of what goes on. And actually, the centralization of power in this country has not produced better outcomes. It has not produced better governments. And a system where views are challenged and people sort of go back and forth and find the best way forward, not just your own way forward, does give, I think, a much better form of politics. And, for the next government, they got to look at this, and they're probably going to be looking at this, bringing it back to the research done by Make Votes Matter. This could be the most disproportionate election in our history, as many people might vote for smaller parties than the next government and have 400 less MPs. That is an entirely possible outcome. There has to be some reaction to that. Otherwise, I think people will be rightly angry. And the levels of trust, low trust in our politics is at a record low, but it could go even lower if 4 in 10 people are sitting there saying, I didn't vote for this. I got nothing for how I voted. And from Labour's point of view, or if it is Labour, as most polls seem to say, I think they've got to look at this and say, well, there's great support for it in their own party. There's great support for it in the country. And whatever our own views might be, it's the right thing to do. And I think governments doing the right thing probably get rewards moving forward.
Well, it's interesting. Kier
The next
Starmer has
government.
talked about governing for the country, bringing back the concept of public
Exactly.
service in government. So you could very well argue that if he's to do that, then PR would be the logical result. Just one final observation from me, Sean, which is that I think if PR came in, we would see a radical reshaping of British politics. A lot of the problems that we've had, I would suggest, in this country have arisen from splits within the two main parties, which have pulled in different directions at the same time. So we have a right-wing grouping, the European Reform Group, ERG, in the Conservative Party, some of which now is drifting towards reform. On the left, you have, if you like, the Corbynite wing of the Labour Party or the Momentum wing of the Labour Party. And if we're to accept that all views are to be heard and to be respected, which is, I think, the essence of a democracy, I suspect the right wing of the Conservative Party, now the Reform Party, the left of the Labour Party, which might evolve into a new party, I think those would have greater say in a parliament elected under PR than we currently do. And some people might not like that. Other people, I think, would love it because they'd think, okay, we're not going to be the government of the day, but we have got, at some level, a stake in this democracy.
Yeah, and I think that's really fair. I mean, it's impossible to predict how things might shake out in terms of political parties, but I think the potential for this to change political culture is huge. And let's just almost take it back for a second to candidates, people that run for election. If you are, say, a conservative person living in a part of the country where there are no conservatives, you're not going to run for parliament in your area because you know you're going to lose. There's no chance. And so you just don't get involved. The culture we have in our politics, where it's so polarized and so confrontational, is putting off so many good people from being involved in our politics. And I think if we did have that sort of different atmosphere, different culture, better culture that was slightly less polarized and much more collegiate, I think you'd have a lot more people saying, you know what, I will get involved in politics. And that will lead to, I think, a much, much better parliament, government, and political culture throughout. You can't force 50 million people into just two camps anymore. I don't know. Those camps become so broad, you just can't actually make it work.
Sean, thank you. That's Sean Roberts from Unlock Democracy. I'm Adrian Goldberg. You've been listening to the Byline podcast. And just to remind you as well, we come from Byline Audio, bylineaudio.com. And that is a fantastic new audio stream from the Byline Times. You can go over to bylineaudio.com and you can join and get this podcast ad-free. You can get extra content as well. We have a free offering, which is Utter Bollocks, which is a myth-busting podcast, very funny too, with Otto English and John Mitchinson. You've got Travels in Americana with Bonnie Greer and the Byline Times editor Hardeep Matharu. So a lot of this content is free. Some of it is behind a paywall so that you can help support the excellent work that we like to think we do. So head over to bylineaudio.com to listen to more free content and see if we can't persuade you to sign up for a little bit of premium content as well. Thanks for listening. We'll see you again soon. Cheers now. Bye-bye.